Hey, we got a call about a male hitting a female and the two of them getting in this vehicle and taking off.
So you
want to tell me about those scratches on your face?
She had her cell phone in her hand. That's why I was pushing her away.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is the third deep dive in the series dealing with the Moab incident, and the purpose of these deep dives aren't to log all the instances where the Moab cops made mistakes and then wag our fingers at them. The point is actually to find out more about the character of Gabby Petito, as well as the type of person Brian Laundrie was, and then also to figure out the dynamic between the couple. Secondary to all that, yes, we are interested in how the Moab cops went off track at a crucial time, and where there was an opportunity to recognize what has happened, what was it that happened to Gabby, and perhaps prevent the catastrophe that followed. In a previous live stream, I was looking at the animal nature of Brian, and then looking at the thinking animal that is any person, saying, on what side does evil reside? And I was trying to make the point that a lot of people think that someone who commits a crime is an animal, that they get emotional, that it's rage and so on. And I tend to think it's something else. I think a decision is made, a calculated decision is made to do something, and that resides in the higher functions. So whereas once upon a time, I do think what was necessary for man was to become a more cerebral creature, more thinking creature, a less physical creature. I think where we are today, we need to be more animals than, I know that sounds a bit strange, but we need to be more animal-like, in tune with our bodies, in tune with the environment, in tune with the world, in tune with the rhythms of nature, eating, sleeping, and being healthy, than this endless gnawing on the bone, the endless thinking. That was the point I meant to make. So if you are interested in this sort of psychological analysis, you're interested in this deep, meticulous psychological surgery, then if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started.
You want to tell me about those scratches on your face?
She had her cell phone in her hand. That's why I was pushing her away. Because she wanted I locked the keys so I could walk away. I said, let's just take a breather and let's not go anywhere. Let's just calm down for a minute because she was getting a little worked up. And then she had her phone and was trying to get the keys for me, so I got away. I was just trying to, I know I shouldn't push, but I was just trying to push her away to go, let's just take a minute, step back and breathe. And she got me with her phone.
Can I see your hand? Oh, you got a mark right here.
Oh, that's from a wire.
That's from a wire?
Yeah.
You want to tell me about hitting that curb?
Hitting the curb was her grabbing the wheel.
She grabbed the wheel?
Yeah. She said, I can't believe we're getting pulled over, and then she grabbed the wheel.
What about the speed? Did she take over the pedal on you?
If I was going fast, I'm sorry. No, it's probably just the moment of, I'm still shaking now. The adrenaline, seeing the lights flashing up, and then her grabbing the wheel. So if I sped up, I'm sorry about that. Or if I was speeding beforehand, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, it took quite a bit to catch up to you. So,
yeah. I'm sorry about that. We're just going into the park again to get water because we have a 6-gallon water container to fill up, so we're just grabbing water for the hike. Okay. And I was trying to keep everything calm and quiet because there's plans still to go for a hike, but then she goes, I'm really sorry about that.
Of course. Do me a favor, you want to go ahead and just take a seat right over here on the curb for me?
And if I was speeding, I'm sorry. I apologize.
You don't have anything in my pocket or anything like that, do you?
Nope.
Just the wallet? Alright. And then, do you mind lifting your shirt so I can check the waistband?
So do you think that Brian actually answers the question, how did you get those scratches on your face, through that sort of garbled response? Now we are going to go close to the round about 9-minute mark, again going through around about 3.5 minutes of the body cam. And does it really explain how he got the scratches? Because he talks about something about a phone and keys and trying to push Gabby away. Was it that he was trying to push her away and then she slapped him? What is really going on? So it's not really clear. And once again, the officer doesn't really clarify. So I don't know about you. To me, I'm not 100% clear on exactly how the scratches, appeared on his face. What was the thing that he did that upset Gabby, the whole dynamic. So I'm not clear about it. I don't know if the officer was clear. If the officer wasn't clear, he should have clarified. Does that make sense? So we're now at 5:32 in the body cam. Officer Robbins asks Brian about the scratches on his face. And now put yourself in his position, in Officer Robbins' position. Gabby's not outright accusing Brian of much besides stressing her out. And Brian's a little more explicit in blaming Gabby for hitting him. But regardless of what Gabby and Brian are saying, there have been two separate eyewitnesses that saw something. And it's the officer's job to figure out what that was and who is to blame. And then at this moment right here, he notices fresh scoring on Brian's cheek, scratches as it happens. And he hasn't noticed any injuries at this point on Gabby. I've heard some people saying, they should have gotten his license and registration, but I don't think the officer was thinking about it as a traffic issue, although that did come up later. I think he was more concerned about who injured who, and in terms of it being a domestic incident, who was responsible, right? So the fact is both Gabby and Brian have injuries, right? That's a fact. Both Gabby and Brian have injuries, but Officer Robbins notices Brian's injuries first, and they're on his face, which is quite serious. Of course, Gabby's also got an injury on her face, on the one side of her cheek, the side facing away from the officers when they're talking to her. And Brian also gets the first word in about Gabby injuring him, right? Brian gets the first word in about Gabby hurting him, whereas Gabby doesn't do the same. And so the momentum is continuing to shift, that it is Gabby who's the perpetrator here in the minds of the officers. And all of this is within the context of Gabby having already been sequestered into the cruiser. So, I don't think it's hard for Brian to think, well, she's already in the cruiser, she is actually the one in trouble, and the officer's now asking about injuries to his face, right? It's all starting to make sense to him. At this point, Brian may have felt he'd gotten one up on Gabby and was perhaps pretty content about this. But then 10 minutes later, he'd be confronted about laying charges against Gabby. And when that happened, Brian sang a different tune, assuring the officers that he loved Gabby and wanting to know how to get rid of it, meaning how to get rid of the charges. So at this point, he's kind of setting himself up as the victim. And then shortly off, about 10 minutes later, we'll get to that, about 15 minutes into the audio, he wants to undo what he's sort of done here. One wonders if Brian knew what was about to go down 10 minutes later. If he did know, whether he would have tempered his story a little differently. In any event, this was Brian's version of what Gabby did to him. And I've played that for you earlier, but in case you missed it, this is the text for what he said. And the part that I want to emphasize is this part. So as soon as Brian is asked, how did you get the scratches on your face? His mind goes to this, that Gabby had a cell phone in her hand. And I think that this is a very important part of what is causing friction between this couple, the cell phone. There's arguments about the cell phone. There's arguments about what is coming into that cell phone and going out. And I've already made the point in a previous video that Rose Davis, it was her birthday coming up, her 21st birthday. That is quite a big time in a young person's life. And she was hoping to celebrate with Gabby, and Brian probably wasn't too happy about that. And Brian possibly wanted to know what was being discussed, right? Also, what was being said on social media. And so he said, she had a cell phone in her hand, that's why I was pushing her away. And if you think about that, does that make sense to say she had a cell phone in her hand and that's why I was pushing her away? Unless he's saying, she's using the cell phone as a weapon and she was swinging it at him. That's not the impression I get. It was like she had a cell phone in her hand, and so what, right? It doesn't really make sense what he's talking about here. He doesn't, I don't know whether he's editing himself or censoring himself, but she had a cell phone in her hand, and why were you pushing her away? And this is where the officer should have said, what do you mean? And then he says, cause she wanted, I had the keys. I wanted to walk away. I said, let's just take a breather and let's not go anywhere. Let's hang out. And then says something about Gabby being worked up. And there's kind of stuttering here. There's kind of self-interruption. And what is happening here is he's not sure what to say because he doesn't want to get himself into trouble by revealing too much about what really happened. So he says, because I did something or wanted something, then, and this could have been because I wanted to go hiking, she wanted to work on her little blog, right? But I had the keys and I decided what was going to happen. I'm just speculating about what this could be about. And then I wanted to walk away. So at this point, Gabby's becoming quite upset and he says, I wanted to walk away. But he's sort of using coercion. He's saying, well, I'm going to take the keys and I'm going to decide what we're going to do. Bear in mind, it's a hot day. Does she really want to be outside? And then I said, let's just take a breather and let's not go anywhere. Let's hang out, right? It's a little bit garbled and a little bit muffled because there's an engine playing in the background that should have been turned off. It's not very clear what he's saying, but it sounds like he said, let's not go anywhere. Let's hang out. And so I don't know where she wanted to go, but I thought that he wanted to go hiking. And maybe she said, let's do something, and he thought it was a hot day, but there you have it. And then he said, and then had her phone, and he brings up the phone again. The phone is now brought up the second time. The keys brought up the second time as well. So it's like phone and keys. And then he says, I just kind of emotions pushing. I know I shouldn't push, but I was just trying to push away. Just like, let's take a minute, step back and breathe. It's quite interesting, his words here, step back and breathe. If only he did that at the Spread Creek camp. Maybe that was necessary. And in the end, could Gabby breathe given the situation then? If Brian didn't step back? And she got me, and emotions to his eye with her phone. And that's the third reference to phone in this short little thing. Phone, and then she had her phone, cell phone in her hand, right? Look at the words pushing coming up as well. Pushing, motions pushing. I know I shouldn't push. I was just trying to push her away, right? And, you might say hitting is unacceptable, but what about things like pushing or gripping someone or whatever, right? Aren't they just as bad? And we also don't know just how hard the pushing was. It's unfortunate that we don't have CCTV footage. But anyway, so he basically is asked the question, how did you get the scratches on your face? And the answer is basically the beginning and end of this answer, this sentence. It's interesting that he answers immediately that she had a cell phone in her hand and she got me with her phone, right? And it's still not clear, well, she got him for what? For what purpose? Was it because he kind of confiscated the keys? And I think he's saying he confiscated the keys to calm her down, which I don't think did calm her down, right? And it's kind of a form of coercion, not a very good way of calming her down either. I think that taking the keys was a form of controlling her, right? And she did say a little bit later, we're coming to that momentarily, that she was calm. In any event, we now go a little bit further. So there you can actually see the injury on his cheek, and it seems a little bit swollen. Now, some people are saying that Brian inflicted this injury himself, because you don't see it on him sort of earlier in the original body cam, but this was the side of his face that was facing Officer Pratt when he came up to the vehicle. You don't really see that side. So I don't really buy that version of events. In any event, it is a pretty garbled response if you think about it. What is he actually saying? The simple question is, how did you get those scratches? And so the answer is with Gabby's phone, but it's not really, the reason why was Gabby so upset. And so why doesn't he just say, Gabby hit me in the face with her phone? Why doesn't Brian just say that? And the answer, I think, is if he did say that, if it was so simplistic, if there was no noise and fluff around what he was saying, the next question would be why? Why did Gabby hit you with her phone? What did you do? And Brian seems to anticipate this, and he provides a garbled spiel about keys, phone, and pushing, but it's not very clear. If you pay attention, Brian doesn't say what Gabby's worked up about, right? Nor what Gabby actually says or wants. And Gabby does sort of say, and we dealt with this, I think, in the first episode or so, that Gabby was stressed about work, and Gabby was kind of in a bad mood, and Gabby was, to some extent, feeling not happy because Brian said he didn't believe in what she was doing, in the, I guess, the blog kind of thing. And so it's not clear how Gabby's upset with Brian. It's not quite clear, but him taking the keys has got something to do with that. And it's also not clear exactly what Gabby says or wants during this whole altercation. So that part is sort of left a mystery. And it's unfortunate that the officer doesn't try and clarify this. Did Gabby just suddenly become emotional over nothing? I don't think so. Did she just strike him under the eye like someone suffering from a kind of random physical Tourette's? I don't think so. I think another aspect that perhaps puts Gabby and Brian's relationship dynamic into its true perspective is to consider the fact that Gabby hit Brian in the face. Now, you might be looking at it from quite a simplistic perspective where you're saying, who hit who, right? Did Gabby hit Brian or did Brian hit Gabby? But the fact is that Gabby hit Brian in the face. That is how he got this injury, right? And I think it's easy to overlook that. The fact that Gabby hit Brian in the face, that's pretty significant. And I don't want to kind of give excuses for this behavior in general, but you would imagine that Gabby had to have felt very afraid, very anxious, very upset with Brian to do that. And so what is missing in this whole scenario is, what did Brian do to deserve that? And you might say deserve's got nothing to do with it, and he didn't deserve anything or something, but very likely he must have done something. And bear in mind, Gabby does have injuries, but he must have done something resulting in being struck in the face with her phone, right? One thing that is certainly possible is that he tried to take her phone away from her. Bear in mind, he'd taken the keys away. Or what about if he'd taken her phone, right? So I do think the important part about that aspect is it shows a serious degree of animus, I think, between both of them. So although they love each other, there's a serious degree of something that's not love going on between them from both sides. A serious degree of Gabby feeling let down by Brian and Brian feeling not very happy with Gabby, right? And so I think it's between both of them. They may love each other, but both are capable of being extraordinarily unloving to one another, far beyond the norm. So, I don't know about you. How often have you hit someone you really love in the face? I don't think I've ever hit anyone in the face that I love, right? I don't think I've often hit anybody in the face in my entire life. But maybe that's me. Maybe I'm not average. But it is very unusual, I think, to do that. And especially if you're a young person in the situation. Why on earth was that necessary, right? And even if Gabby did hit Brian in the face, it wouldn't be appropriate for Brian to do the same. And it just shows what level of dysfunction and how toxic the relationship already is, the fact that they both have injuries from one another, right? So they also seem to be taking out their anxieties on one another, and this is something that the one officer brings up. I'm not sure how constructive or useful that is, but we'll get to that. For me, the critical piece of information here is Brian referring to Gabby's phone. I wouldn't be surprised if the real reason they were arguing, as I said earlier, was about Gabby's phone. And, him saying he didn't believe in what she was doing and that he really stresses her out. One of the ways that someone can be stressed out constantly by someone else is by the one person on their phone all the time and the other one agitated as a result of this. But it's different, I think, if you're working. And you can do a certain amount of social media work with your phone, taking photos, putting up captions, checking the traction of your content. That is something I do quite often. I need to know how well a video is doing to know how soon I must do the next one. That's certainly how I do. So, and someone might feel, wow, who are you checking messages from? Who are you answering? But you're actually doing your work, right? So what she'd said on it, what she'd said on her phone, how much she was using it, who she intended to call, all these things could stress Brian out. Perhaps Brian told her if she didn't stop using her phone or something else specific regarding it, he wasn't going to let her back in the van, right? He was trying to set the pace, call the shots, stay in control, right? And it is possible that Brian noticed someone taking a particular or peculiar interest in Gabby and Brian didn't like that. And every time Gabby looked at her phone, that would trigger him in some way. It's certainly possible. It's one explanation. Now, remember, if Brian didn't believe in what Gabby was doing, then he would say things in a manner and act in a manner congruent with that. He would constantly be saying, part of that whole response would be that he didn't want her to invest so much time and energy and attention on her little blog and the business because he wanted that investment of time and energy and attention to be on him, right? My impression was that he wanted to hike around the arches that day, whereas Gabby wanted to work. And this does come up a few times in this Moab incident, him talking about going to hike, in the arches. Now, consider the conflict and the contradiction in the scenario where whenever you're in a scenic environment, so bear in mind there's some epic, they were going from scenic environment to scenic environment, national park to national park, Instagrammable location to Instagrammable location, right? And so the contradiction is whenever you in this new scenic environment, what do you want? Well, you want to explore and take photos and enjoy it. But you also simultaneously on the job, you're now compelled to sell, pitch, and post all of that online. So how can you enjoy being somewhere when you're in that environment, you need to start working it, you need to start selling it, you need to start pitching it. And so for one person that might come naturally, for another it may not be fun, it may not be enjoyable, it may be the moment you're in a scenic environment, your partner's gone. They are thinking about somebody else, they're thinking about their audience, it's a totally different thing. And Brian may not have liked that. So the moment you enter an outdoor theater that's picturesque, awe-inspiring, and otherwise interesting, one person wants to document it and give it the social media treatment, while the other wants to experience it and share it. And I'm talking about sharing it directly with the person that you're with, whereas the person that you're with is thinking of sharing it with the anonymous audience, right? And that can be, I think, quite off-putting. So it's like going to the beach on a hot day, but instead of swimming, the person you're with, all they want to do is take photos of the shells. Where's the fun in that? I mean, seriously.
Where's the fun in that?
So if we go back to the audio at the 6-minute mark, Robin says, "Can I see your hand?" And Brian at that point sort of doesn't really lift his hands up, but sort of looks down almost guiltily at them, right? Bear in mind, he's done something with his hands to Gabby at this point, and in 2 weeks he would also allegedly also do something with those same hands, and he's got quite big hands. And Robin says, "Oh, you've got a mark right here," and he motions to this area on the sort of top of his wrist and forearm. And Brian says, "No, that is actually a wire made that mark." So Brian dismisses the cut on his hand as from a wire. It could be, of course, but if you think about it, a fingernail and a jutting piece of wire can often leave the same thin, jagged line on the skin. So it's unclear whether Brian is being honest here or not. Officer Robbins basically has to frog march Brian through one misdemeanor after the other, and so next up is Brian's driving. And Robbins says, "Do you want to tell me about hitting the curb?" And you'll notice here, there's no smiling from Brian. There are quite a few apologies. Brian is looking a little pensive here as well, but there's very little smiling going on. And then Brian says the hitting the curb was her grabbing the wheel, right? And this puts into perspective again how hard the situation was to deal with, because I don't know if this part was true. Gabby said she never grabbed the wheel. So which one of them is lying? I don't know what to make of this myself. I don't know whether Gabby did grab the wheel. What do you think? Do you think Gabby did grab the wheel? Do you think if she did grab the wheel, she would have said so? Do you think Brian is telling the truth here? It's just difficult to know. So anyway, Gabby would later be asked if she ever grabbed or touched the wheel, and Gabby denied that she did. Instead, she said she punched him in the arm while he was driving. And, one must wonder then, did Brian change direction because he was being punched in the arm? That's difficult to imagine. In any event, once again, Brian has instantly blamed Gabby for something he apparently did, right? I do wonder whether while driving, while the cops were following Brian, whether Gabby punched him in the face, if that happened then, trying to force him to slow down and stop. And so I know she said she punched him in the arm, but if she punched him in the face while he was driving, you can almost imagine that leading to hitting the curb, a sudden swerve. That could be quite a shocking moment, right? And but what she's trying to do is force him to slow down and stop, and he won't. So if Gabby just sat there, what was Brian going to do? Have like a O.J. Simpson low-speed car chase through the national park? Anyway, Robin says her grabbing the wheel, so he's a little bit unsure. And then Brian says, "Yeah, she said, I can't believe we're being pulled over," and then she grabbed the wheel. I think right here you can see also how dirty and lived in Brian's shirt is. You can see that he may have been wearing it for quite a while. And whereas Gabby looks neat and tidy, right? The shirt looks, there's a bit of a sweat stain there. He certainly looks less. He looks very average. And he looks less tidy, certainly than the officer next to him. Brian is the most slobbily dressed of all the people in the Moab incident, by far. Anyway, Robin says, what about the speed? Was that Gabby's fault too? Did she stomp on Brian's foot, causing the van to go faster? Well, of course not. Brian said, no, it was probably just adrenaline. My hand's still shaking now. The light's flashing. He mumbles. A lot of what he says is mumbling, and her grabbing the wheel. So he is kind of blaming her. What about the speed? Oh, her grabbing the wheel. How does that make sense? So the speed is totally Brian's fault and his responsibility. At this point, fielding one accusation after another, Brian starts looking less tense and starts to appear almost amused. It's also at this point that I find myself asking, what did Gabby see in this guy? What did she see in him? To me, he has a scrawny, wriggling worminess about him. He doesn't seem to be charming. He doesn't seem to be charismatic. What is so special about this person? So Brian goes on to say, if I sped up, I'm sorry about that. If I was speeding beforehand, I'm sorry about that. Robbins Riley says, it took quite a bit to catch up to you. Brian says again, I'm sorry, and then instantly changes the subject, saying, we are just going into the park to get water, right? And this changing the subject makes me wonder whether Brian was coming off something, because he just seems to be, he seems kind of jumpy, and his mind seems to be struggling to focus. Had he not had enough sleep? What is going on with that? Does he have ADD or ADHD? So I do think that Brian, especially if you watch this a few times and you watch his arm movements and face movements, and when the officer comes up behind him, he sort of looks around. He looks left, looks right, gestures left, gestures right, and he seems to be struggling to hold on to a thought. Do you see that? Do you see how he's just all over the place in a way? Almost like he's dancing. And so at this point, Brian mentions a hike again, and I've highlighted that here. And one really does get the impression that's what he wanted to do, and that was what he was preoccupied with. And then he apologized for the umpteenth time. One area where I thought Officer Robbins was quite weak, I've said this before, was that he didn't press or push or interrogate Brian on any of his answers, including these things about speeding, including, finding out a little bit more about how the hitting the curb thing happened, right? So Officer Robbins would just ask a question, Brian would answer, and the officer would seemingly accept each answer at face value. In addition to this, I don't think Officer Robbins took any notes. The only note that he took, certainly at this point, by this point, actually a little bit past this point, was Brian's name. And notes might seem irrelevant given he had body cam, but if a cop takes a reporter role, and I'm a writer, and the suspect knows his words are being written down, it may mean the suspect might be less profligate with the truth. They may think a little bit more about what they're saying. And so the very first question, the one about the scratches, gets a garbled response from Brian. And the officer really should have fired off a few more questions to make sure that he understands what is going on, what is being said, what Brian is trying to communicate. What he did, what she did, where, when, and so on. And he could also have Brian act it out. Okay, role play what you did, what she did. He could also remind Brian by saying, would Gabby say the same thing? for example, would Gabby say that she grabbed the wheel? And look at his response to that. Just going through this now, it sort of makes you want to have the officer take Brian to Gabby, and say, Brian says that you grabbed the wheel, did you? And then see what she responds, and then see what he says, and just get a sense of the dynamic in that moment, right? It's something that you often do with children. So I think he could have taken more notes, and he could have nudged Brian in the right direction more often, I think. At 6 minutes 50 into the footage, sort of interrupting Brian's apology, and Brian apologized quite a few times, and talking about hiking, Officer Robbins motions Brian to take a seat, pointing towards the curb behind him. One has the impression he now wants to get Gabby's version of events on what Brian has just said. And bear in mind, Gabby's kind of in a little bit of trouble at this point, given what Brian has said about her. Brian continues to apologize. If I was speeding, I'm sorry. The fact that he's got to sit in the curb probably is to him kind of a sign that he might be in trouble. And yeah, Brian kind of offers a weak smile for the first time. Look at that. He feels like, well, I'm not off the hook. Otherwise, the guy would say, well, you can go back to your van, right? The officer ignores this and motions instead to Brian's trousers. He says, you don't have anything in your pockets, do you? And yeah, you get a better sense of how attractive or unattractive Brian is. You see that it really doesn't have any hair. You see, to some extent, the how swollen that one side of his face is. And again, you can also see to some extent how dirty his shirt is. Brian shows him his wallet and then walks off. And then Robin says, do you mind lifting your shirt? Which Brian does. And Brian seems quite bemused by this. And now we're at the 7-minute mark. I'm not going to take it too much further. Robin says, I just want to make sure, that's all, man. Oh, do you have your ID on you? And then Brian says, well, he points, it's in the car. And he sort of rises up. But the officer doesn't want him to go to his car, right? And so the officer stops Brian from heading to the vehicle and scribbles down his name instead. So here he is using his notebook. After giving his details, Brian makes an interesting request.
You want to tell me about hitting that curb?
Hitting the curb was her grabbing the wheel.
She grabbed the wheel?
Yeah. She said, I can't believe we're getting pulled over, and then she grabbed the wheel.
What about the speed? Did she take over the...
No, I
take over the pedal on you?
If I was going fast, I'm sorry. No, it's probably just the moment of, I'm still shaking now. The adrenaline, seeing the lights flashing up, and then her gripping the wheel. So if I sped up, I'm sorry about that. Or if I was speeding beforehand, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, it took quite a bit to catch up to you. So,
yeah. I'm sorry about that. We're just going into the park again to get water because we have a 6-gallon water container to fill up. So we're just grabbing water for the hike. Okay. And I was trying to keep everything calm and quiet because they're planning still to go for a hike. But then she goes, I'm sorry about that.
Of course. Do me a favor. You want to go ahead and just take a seat right over here on the curb for me?
And if I was speeding, I'm sorry. I want to apologize.
You don't have anything in that pocket or anything like that, do you?
Nope.
Just the wallet? All right. And then, do you mind lifting your shirt so I can check the waistband?
I got it.
Turn around for me real quick.
Perfect. Nothing.
I just want to make sure. That's all, man. Go ahead, do me a favor, take a seat, all right? Oh, do you have your ID on you?
In the car, if you want to come with me.
No, we'll just do this. Just go ahead and take a seat.
You can come with me, I'll give it to you.
No, you're fine. What's your first name?
Brian.
Brian? Is that layman spelling?
B-R-I-N, yeah, and L-A-U-N.
And then your last name?
L-A-U-N.
L-A-U-N.
D-R-I-E.
D-R-I-E?
Yep.
Laundry? Mm-hmm. Okay. What's your date of birth, Brian?
I'll say crisscross applesauce, but can I just sit in the shade because I'm bald? It's okay. I'll give you some shade. Sound good?
Alright, just hang tight for me. SO229. I need a 29.
So this part I thought was quite interesting, where Brian said, "Can I just sit in the shade because I'm bald?" And interestingly, the officers don't wish to comply. Officer Robbins doesn't want him going back to or closer to the vehicle, and so basically just ignores his request. They kind of want Brian to be away from the vehicle where they can clearly see him and fairly close to them as well. But then the park ranger sort of steps closer and he offers to stand with his shadow over Brian, prompting a guffaw from Brian. Brian seems to think this is hilarious. And this also makes me wonder, Brian's mentality seems a bit odd. Was he on some kind of substance that was making him behave in a bit of a strange way? Or is this just his personality? Is he just immature? So there he is laughing. And so on the way to the cruiser, Robbins calls in Brian Laundrie's details based on what he's jotted down in his notebook. He's trying to, find out whether Brian has any priors. And he didn't do that with Gabby, of course. And that is what he's sort of preoccupied with. That is where his attention is when he walks towards Gabby. And at this point, you can actually hear Officer Pratt talking to Gabby. And at this point, she's being asked, did she hit him, and how many times did she hit him? And that is what is being spoken about while Officer Robbins is standing there, almost eavesdropping, but basically waiting for information from the dispatcher. And there you can see Brian in the background, sitting in the shade of the park ranger. I'm not going to take it too much further than this. At 8:36, Officer Robbins approaches the door where Officer Pratt is leaning in, talking with Gabby. And the first words he overhears, you can actually hear them, is where Pratt says, "Where'd you hit him?" Gabby's response is a little bit hard to hear. Pratt says, "You slapped him first on his face?" ? And Pratt then gestures to his own face. Pratt says, "How many times did you slap him?" And bear in mind, Pratt may be sort of overhearing what Robbins and Brian have been saying, right? He might be able to slightly hear it. Officer Robbins is hovering silently nearby now. He's the one hovering nearby. He's the one overhearing what is being said while awaiting a response from his radio. At this point, and now we're heading to the 9-minute mark, Officer Robbins edges closer to the open passenger door of his vehicle in order to see Gabby and hear what she's saying. So I'm not going to take it further than that, but we will deal with that, what Gabby says what happened in terms of these injuries, in the next episode. The part I really want to emphasize about this episode is that you get a kind of a better idea and understanding of the kind of person Brian is. Also, is what he says trustworthy? Is what he says true? And also the fact that both of these young people are hitting one another in the face. Gabby does say that the injury she got to her cheek was from trying to climb over him, but it does show an intensity to their relationship that certainly wasn't healthy. And that intensity was borne out 2 weeks later when one of them lost their lives, and then a couple of weeks after that when he lost his lives. The whole problem was this intensity. Did it really need to be so intense? And what was driving that intensity? Wasn't it anxiety and immaturity and fear and inexperience, as well as perhaps overthinking? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.